Welcome back to IMF and World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. My name is Ananya Kumar. I'm the Deputy Director for Future of Money at the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to be all of your MC for the program today. To kick us off, I'm delighted to introduce Adrian Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. Adrian, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here and through Zoom. I'm going to speak a little slowly because we're involved in simultaneous translation, English and Portuguese, and I wouldn't venture to speak in Portuguese. As the world's finance ministers meet here in Washington, D.C. to discuss the future of global economy, Latin America and the Caribbean must be front and center of these conversations, which is why I'm delighted to be here and to welcome each of you from our studio in Washington, D.C., and those watching around the world. This is our inaugural conference focused on Latin America and the Caribbean on the sidelines of the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in partnership with the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. This is part of the Atlantic Council's World Bank IMF annual meeting series, convening finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world. Latin America and the Caribbean, home to major emerging economies, faces a period of low economic growth, battling against inflation. The region's growth rate is among the lowest in all global regions, estimated at 1.9%. This is a key moment for Latin America and the Caribbean to seize the momentum to address persistent structural bottlenecks, fiscal challenges, and continued inequality, and to unlock the unique opportunities for growth and investment in the region. As it turns this corner, the World Bank already forecasts the region to grow by 2.6%. Today's conversation will explore avenues for the region and individual countries to further accelerate inclusive and sustainable economic growth now and in the years to come. First, we will hear from Brazil's Minister of Budget and Planning, Simone Tebet, followed by insights from Panama's Minister of Economy and Finance, Philippe Chapman. And we'll wrap the day with an analysis of the regional economic outlook with regional and development experts. With that, I'd like to again thank our partners, the World Bank Group, namely Felipe Jaramillo, here with us today, and the International Finance Corporation. I thank them for their support and partnership, and thank our institutional partner, the Institute for International Finance, for joining us in this effort. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first conversation for the day with Brazil's Minister of Budget and Planning, Simone Tebet. Minister Tebet has been leading Brazil's Minister of Budget and Planning since January 2023. But she has a long career in Brazilian public service. She began dedicating herself to public service in her home state of Mato Grosso do Sul, in Brazil's Midwest region, as senator, lieutenant governor, and mayor. Minister Tebet, we are delighted to have you with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Valentina Sedar, Deputy Director and Brazil lead, who will moderate this conversation in Portuguese. Valentina?
question. The Brazilian economy has surpassed expectations of growth, and it's expected to grow by 3.4% compared to 2.5%, which was forecast. To what do we owe this increased forecast, and how is the Brazilian government trying to stimulate the market so that there can be greater growth in the future? Before anything else, good afternoon, everyone, and I thank Adrian and everyone else. I want to compliment everybody, greet everybody. I'm not going to try to pronounce everyone's last name. I'm sorry, but I'm very happy to be here at the Atlantic Council to thank you and to speak a little bit about the challenges that Brazil faces in the Caribbean as well. Valentina's question is $1 million question because it's the question that we're asking ourselves in Brazil. I believe that in the last 15 years, the Brazilian economy has changed a great deal. Um, Coming from the interior of Brazil and having had the opportunity to study in Rio de Janeiro, master's degree in São Paulo, and have lived 10 years in the capital of Brazil. So besides having gone from north to south of Brazil over the past 2 years, first as a candidate for president of the Republic, and then building our participatory planning throughout the last 4 years until 2026, I should say, I dare say that not even Brazil understands the Brazil of today. We have various Brazils within Brazil today, but there's been a radical change in terms of the geo economy. Brazil has become like a center west of the United States. The agricultural frontier of Brazil has really gained traction, and it's sort of moving the Brazilian economy. But a lot of measures, Valentina, in microeconomy and structural reforms have occurred over the past 8 years. And I'm speaking as somebody who was in the Senate and who had the opportunity to vote for some of these changes, like the labor reforms, the Social Security reform, the basic sanitation framework. So, and a many measures that made Brazil more secure judicially and also more stable in so many ways. But in terms of your first question, I would say that the positive expectations have a lot to do with the economic diversity of the country, not only in terms of agribusiness, but of these structural reforms, other reforms that are being that are underway. We're giving money to those that need money, the working class, the poor people, those who aren't used to savings. But this has generated industry and industrial growth, and thus surpassing growth expectations. You you touched on two themes that I wanted you to get more into. You talked about structural reforms. Brazil underwent some important reforms, the tax reform and Social Security reform, which are essential for fiscal sustainability in Brazil. What are the expectations in terms of the new phase of implementation of tax reform in view of what you're dealing with in Brazil? What are going to be the real impacts of this in the balance of public accounts in Brazil, given these reforms? I struggle for these changes since I started my public service. Of all of these reforms, this would I would say is the mother of the reforms. We had a tax system that was chaotic in Brazil. We debated all, we had excessive bureaucracy. We had 65 laws to be analyzed. to determine whether you could open a business. Now we have 5 taxes that are becoming just 2. We have the IVA, which is the federal tax, a federative system that's different from the American system, and we have the IVA that unifies the state and the municipal tax. This IVA allows that products be taxed at the point of consumption, and this eliminates a lot of bureaucracy and allows businesses to be more productive. So just so you can have an idea, this is a question that's always asked me. There's data that points to the fact that when this kind of reform is implemented in Brazil, has the ability to increase in 0.8 the gross national product in Brazil, and much more as of a couple of years from now. So it has a great deal of impact in terms of growth, GNP growth in Brazil. And we're talking about great 6 to 7 million more jobs to be generated through these reforms, through greater efficiencies. And the federal government will also garner more through these tax reforms. This is very significant. Finally, we're also regulating through the Congress, and within 30 days, the Chamber of Deputies will approve the new regulations, the new tax regulations. So that we're going to have these significant impacts. And this goes to my second question, which is more logistical. Brazil, which is different from many countries in the world, has 3 ministries that are dedicated to economic questions: the finance, economic development, and budget and planning. Within this scenario, and also for the future, what's the importance of a ministry that's focused on budget and planning, which is a singular situation in Brazil? Brazil is a continental-sized country like the United States, but we have so many more challenges, really. We have a lot to do. We have 3 ministries in the economic area with different functions, and we have a lot of the same functions, of course, but many different ones as well. Let me talk a little bit about the budget and planning role. We have 2 tracks, I might say, or we have one road with 2 branches. I have the Ministry of Today, which is budget, which is the daily task, which is to invest the money that we have at hand. We spend a lot, and we spend it poorly, unfortunately. And spending a lot isn't the problem. It's spending money poorly. When you spend on public education in an efficient way, that's quality spending, and it turns into good investment. But the problem is that Brazil spends poorly because there's no proper culture of spending. And so we recreated in this government, after 4 years, the Ministry of Planning, and we're trying to change this culture of not having a culture of planning in Brazil. And in terms of planning, again, and to guarantee predictability, and that we not spend more than we tax, we have a secretariat of evaluation of public policies that evaluate beforehand new public policies and analyzing the prior public policies. That's the speedy review. It's not easy in terms of our government. We focus on these tasks. And as far as planning, it's looking to the medium and long term. And there are three basic tasks in terms of this work. We have the medium-term planning throughout the country. What kind of, we asked our citizens, what kind of country do you have in the next 4 years? And the people answer in a very curious way. What people want most of what we hear through the internet is that we have actions that require combating climate change throughout the world, and also considerations of racial equality and the role of women and children in budget planning, and the question of sustainability and climate change. So when we ask the population, what are your needs and what are your anxieties, they always touch on these issues. I'm going to be very objective and say our greatest challenge, and I'm very proud to say that we have a great team that works on this, and to say that Brazil, for the first time in its history, is going to do a strategy, a 2050 strategy, which is a long-term strategy, that this is what Brazil wants for the next 25 years. Where we want to go, where we want to be in 2030, in 2040, and 2050. And our focus is inclusive development without leaving anyone behind, with through fiscal responsibility and an environment that's sustainable from the environmental point of view. And I'm very optimistic as to this strategy, and it's going to be presented in COP30 next year by President Lula before the world and the Brazilian people. It's very important. Don't worry about the time, but it's important to think about this process. This is a consultative one with the Brazilian population as far as planning. And this should be mentioned. And we should also say that through your ministry and the Brazilian government as a whole, how these responses are going to be presented to the population and how it's going to be incorporated in the planning. And I'm happy to have received here at the Atlantic Council some of your secretaries, Amaral, Sérgio, and who also told us a bit about this new method of measuring the success of public policies. And also in my next question, I can see that there's also about planning. There's a question of stimulating foreign investment, which is important for the growth of Brazil. And we've seen that the numbers are going beyond expectations in terms of foreign investment. But as far as the structural perspective, the weight of investment in the total economy is still below that of the average of emerging markets. What are the incentives that the government's implementing to create a more favorable investment environment? You've talked about tax reform as one of these incentives already. Well, we can say that that gross capital formation is going beyond what's expected. There's going to be more than 5% growth in this area, which means that we're able to guarantee infrastructures for new investments. But beyond these reforms, these structural reforms that guarantee predictability, a strong judicial structure, and on the microeconomic level, I should have mentioned the autonomy of the central bank, which was approved when I was in the federal Senate. It's also important to say that we know that we have an opportunity through an ecological policy. We can this isn't a cost. This means opportunity of transforming our assets. We have, in terms of the largest forest in the world, we have the opportunity to advance as far as bioeconomy, ecological transition. There's many resources available so that we can transform our transport rates, our transport resources in accordance with the new demands. and we can differentiate the tax system in order to accommodate these demands. And I'm not going to, the Minister of Finance is here in Washington tomorrow. He's going to be inaugurating the new platform, a new digital platform, so that everyone can understand this new strategic plan of ecological change that's sustainable and it takes into account the bioeconomy, the circular economy, and we can talk hours about this issue and everything that's being managed and thought about and the number of projects that are being considered in the National Congress. But I think that this is what's most important. I think we should talk about the challenges as well. We have huge challenges when we talk about investments. We're trying to eliminate bureaucracy. We're opening the doors to investment. We're looking for partnerships, private, public partnerships. But we have to do a lot more. We have to do our homework. The great challenge we have is that we're growing. We have inflation under control, but we have a great deal of costs in terms of interest rates. We have to, we're going to hand over to Lula the measures for containing costs and so that we can guarantee the sustainability of public debts and lower interest rates and have an environment, a more attractive environment for investments. You've mentioned the issue of climate and sustainability, and I want to mention Washington and the world. Brazil is among the most important economies in the world. It's a very important actor in global discussions, and the G20 will be hosted there, and the BRICS and COP30. Brazil is at the center of issues of great importance and magnitude in terms of financing, climate financing, and the fact that Brazil's a vanguard and the leader in these agendas of sustainable development. How have you advanced this domestically and internationally, and how will there be space for greater cooperation internationally for sustainable development and for climate development in Brazil and throughout the world? You answered your question to a certain extent. I also said a lot about the domestic situation of our country, but you're talking here about of our international partners. And yes, we understand the responsibility that we have in having the largest forests in the world. And the question of deforestation is also something that's very real to us. The fires, the deforestation, and we have our goals in mind by 2030 of zero illegal deforestation. And we're going to change this picture so that the Amazon can this will become an asset for us, these forests, and we can manage CO2 emissions through the forests, and this will all these plans will all be public through social media. But we can't do this alone. We need partners. We need the multilateral banks, which are excellent partners. The World Bank has a partnership with us, the Inter-American Development Bank, through Amazonia Viva. The Atlantic Council is also a great partner for us around this issue of the environment. And so it doesn't involve only financial capital. We need expertise. We need know-how. We need technology. We need the technology that the United States has at hand, satellite monitoring, to go inside the Amazon and see what's happening in terms of illegal settlements. So what we hope for and what President Lula, G20, in the context of the G20 is doing in terms of building a sustainable world mentions three dimensions, and one is the agenda of sustainability, of environmental sustainability. That's going to be one of the a major focus. And then we have COP30 in the Amazon, and we're going to be meeting these challenges, and you're going to have to learn about these issues, dealing with the mosquitoes and the heat, but it's going to happen there. And remember, there are 25 million Brazilians who live in the region who depend on sustainability, while the forest and the as long as a an exploited forest is worth more than a standing forest, we're in trouble. So we have the conditions, we have the wherewithal to change the situation. And maybe you have further questions during the next 7 minutes, and we can talk more about also partnerships with other countries in South America. You mentioned about 3 or 4 more questions that I have, but we have very little time, so I'm going to put together 2 questions. I'm going to join 2 questions. We're here in Washington, D.C. this week, where ministers and the governors of central banks are meeting during the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. And these multilateral meetings are very important for the economic development of countries around the world. How has Brazil prioritized partnerships with these organizations? And we're in Washington, where we're having elections in Washington in November. How can Brazil and the United States deepen their relationships, their bilateral relationship beyond the economic realm? I'm sure that the strategic partnership that Brazil has with Washington will continue firm and strong. We we increased our exports to the United States, and we're always open to imports from the United States for those products that we don't have, that we don't produce. So it's a two-way street. The United States is a strategic partner for Brazil, not only for Brazil, but for all of Latin America. It's the greatest world power. And what we expect from the next president is that this partnership continue, and that it continue respecting the objectives of sustainability. We need U.S. know-how, we need technology, and whatever the U.S. has to offer us through and also through multilateral organisms. And I have to be very careful because the elections are upon us, and we have a package of projects to strengthen our partnerships. In this context, we have a project in my ministry, which is the Roots of Integration in South America, which, besides trying to integrate South America and to shorten our distances, it has the ability to narrow distances between Brazil and countries in South America, and also with the west coast of the United States. So there's this new vision of partnership between Brazil and the United States. And I think you touched on my next question, which is about integration, economic integration, and regional integration. We're talking about Latin America and the Caribbean, and projects that are looking to this integration and this greater closeness between the United States and Latin America. After this was made clear after we saw a very important photograph, very interesting photograph. There was a meeting between President Lula and all of the heads of state of Latin America, with the exception of the head of state of Peru, who sent her representative. Everyone was present, from the right, from the left, the extreme right, extreme left governments that have had very different ideologies. And despite these different ideological differences, there was a consensus in terms of departing from this cycle, this vicious cycle of inequality, and they saw the need for regional integration. The Canada, United States, and Mexico, North America, I don't want to touch on, I'm going to touch on round numbers. They say that it's around 40% integration. First, you buy through North America, and then you import from outside of the region. In Asia, it's around 56% integration. In Europe, there's a European commerce of 68% thereabouts. And why? Because of proximity, logistics. It's more efficient. It's an opportunity cost if you don't do so. When you look at South America, Latin America, it's not even 18% this degree of integration. So we have this potential for competition, for integration that involves import-export tourism that can diminish inequalities, generate jobs, and allows us allows us sustainable development. We don't have time to talk about touch on everything, but I'm very optimistic because we have many partnerships, IMF, World Bank. We have a number of partners to enable us to reach this objective. We have billions of dollars for countries. We don't need these resources because we have budgeted for the next 3 years works planned for this new route. And we have the condition to develop one arm for each of these routes from north to the southern point of South America so that we can connect the countries to Asia and to the west coast of the United States by the end of President Lula's term. You answered my last question and talking about the connection with the World Bank, because that's very much talked about here in this week, and we see these actions taking place and the decisions being made and the differences that are being made. And thank you very much. We want to bring you back to the Atlantic Council because there are many questions that are still to be answered, but thank you so much for answering all of my questions, and I hope you're back soon. Thank you very much. I thank you.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you, Minister, for your fascinating comments. It's especially interesting to hear from you on the symbolic and economic role of the Amazon on fiscal opportunities and constraints and the economic diversity of Brazil, especially on the day that the IMF's World Economic Outlook has been released. We're going to move on to another regional outlook from Latin America, and to continue the conversation, I'm very excited to introduce Panama's Minister of Economy and Finance, Minister Felipe Chapman. Minister Chapman took office in July 2024. He comes from extensive experience in the private sector, where he was the president of the Panamanian Stock Exchange, where he spearheaded technological updates and modernization reforms. He was also the managing partner leading economic research in INDESA, a prestigious investment bank and financial services company. To moderate this discussion, I'm going to turn over to Jason Marsak, Vice President and Senior Director of Adrian Arch Latin America Center. And Jason, before I hand over to you, I'm going to thank you for your partnership, not just in this event, but across this week from our side of the Geoeconomic Center. Over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ananya and Mr. Tebet are wonderful, again, for your presentation. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with Minister Felipe Chapman. And we were just discussing beforehand that the last time we were together it was virtually. It was on May 2nd, just a few days before the election, and it was hosting you in your role as managing partner and chairman of INDESA. And so great to be hosting you now as Minister of Economy and Finance. And just, Minister, congratulations on all of your incredible achievements in just the first few months. And I'm also thrilled that we have a number of members of the Panamanian government who are here in the audience today. The Vice Foreign Minister, Carlos Ruiz Hernandez, is here, and our Ambassador Ana Irene Delgado, the ambassador to the OAS, is here. So just wonderful to have you all here and to be a part of this important conversation.
Thank you. And the CEO of the Banco Nacional.
And the CEO of the Banco Nacional, I see sitting next to the Vice Foreign Minister. Great to have you here as well. This is, Minister, this is part of our continued spotlight from the Atlantic Council and from the Adrian Arch Latin America Center on Panama. And all of our excitement around Panama. Adrian, of course, gave opening remarks. She's here in the audience. She is one of the biggest proponents of Panama and all the incredible things that are in your country, including the work of the Smithsonian, and actually we'll be going down to Panama in about a month with Adrian and others. So look forward to seeing you there. Before diving into Panama-specific issues, I'd like to just start with a question about the broader theme of today's conference, which is advancing Latin America and the Caribbean sustainable growth. What do you see as the top priorities to be able to do so?
Oh, first and foremost, thank you. It's a pleasure being with you here in live and in person.
It's great to be here too.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you all for attending and listening to us and the interest in Panama. I was thinking about just that I knew that question was going to come up. Several things come to mind. First of all, I think we must work to strengthen democracy. I think that's vital for the progress of the region. We must emphasize that and the rule of law. I think that's a prerequisite for advancement and development. The main issue among countries, or more than an issue, challenge, would be migration. Panama suffers deeply in the Darien Gap. I was listening to the Brazilian minister, about the environment. Darien is one of the most important tropical rainforests in the Americas and in the world. Yeah. And it's been pounded, and it's been hurting tremendously by this migration. And Panama, it's lifting the burden alone, almost, by a problem that it was not caused by us. And we do understand. So we have to focus on the origins of the problem.
Yeah, and this has been a top priority of President Molino since he came
Yes.
into office. When you look around the world and you look at external threats, what do you see as some of the threats to the Panamanian economy as you're looking to 2025 and beyond, and maybe even other countries in the region that you think it's important to be continuing to be laser focused on? Of course, we're here as part of the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF, and I thank again Felipe Jaramillo at the World Bank and Alfonso at the IFC for being our partner in this event. But as you look around the world, what should we be thinking about external shocks for the?
I usually take for granted about what Panama is about within the world, but I'm sure that many people are aware that Panama, given its characteristics in size, the economy, population, size of the country, has been succeeding and will succeed to being fully connected to the world. So we have to look outwards, not inwards, in terms of what I just mentioned. Myself, I worry more about external threats than internal, probably threats. Externally, most worried about going back 100 years in protectionism. I think that's a wrong decision, and that's what produced somehow big wars in the past, which we don't want, and that somehow have been the trigger of economic crisis 100 years ago and so. So there's plenty of history to illustrate that that's a wrong path. The consequence of that, one of the consequences of that, beyond geopolitical instability, is trade. Yeah. And that really comes to Panama. Panama has a very strong correlation among trade and our GDP performance. The Panama Canal, of course. Right. But even though the Panama Canal only it's about 6% of GDP, it does have a multiplier effect, which is quite important to the economy. Other matters that obviously worry us is interest rates. We use the dollar. It's also commodities. We import everything, all refined oil products, and a lot of commodities, including fertilizers, including beans somehow, and some grains. So global stability it is. It is definitely worrisome for us Panamanians.
And you raised an interesting point as well about, and I think when people think about the canal, they don't necessarily think about all the indirect effects, the indirect job creation, the indirect impact on the Panamanian economy. I think it's a really important point. I want to go in more depth into the canal in a moment, but I want to begin by asking you on the fact that Panama has long been recognized for its macroeconomic stability, despite global economic fluctuations, despite supply chain disruptions. Panama's oftentimes seen as the Singapore of the region. I know the Panamanians like to, I see your smile as I mentioned that as well. If you could share a little bit more about the measures that President Molino, the Molino government has taken, now approaching almost the 4-month mark, to continue this stability, this macroeconomic stability that Panama has long been known for, and also how do you plan to protect against potential external shocks? You mentioned a few, but also shocks like inflationary pressures.
Great question. This is my first role as a public servant. I come from a career of about 35 years in the private sector. And people who have listened to me before know about my train of thought, which has not changed. And one of the reasons I'm sitting talking here with you because President Molino and I think alike in that sense. So one of our goals is to strengthen an open market economy, the rule of law, and the freedom for entrepreneurship. That's something quite important. And the driver of that is trust. Trust. And to produce that, you have to start with transparency. And something I usually tell people in Panama is transparency, it's good business because it eliminates uncertainty, speculation, and some other things like, theories of conspiration,
conspiracy. It helps to drive investment into the economy, right?
Completely. And one proof of that is the behavior of the prices of Panamanian bonds. Just look at them in the past 90 days. Yeah. Markets do appreciate transparency, to be frank and to, in my DNA, I say what I think and I walk the talk. So that's what we're delivering. And proof of that is the budget that we presented to Congress, the reform that we just presented in terms of the fiscal reform, in terms of the responsibility fiscal law that we presented. It's going to be, another evidence going to be our 5-year plan, including 5-year fiscal plan. We're going to be retaking long-term planning. And I smile when you say Singapore because it's going to be based on Asian vision of very long term, thinking about the next generation. And we're going to strengthen that, and we want that to be one of our most important legacies.
And as we think about your long-term vision, the credit agencies appreciate that type of long-term vision. And of course, there was earlier this year, there was the downgrade. What are you anticipating insofar as Panama's ability, especially with regard to Fitch, to restore that investment grade? I assume that the vision is this long-term plan, that long-term stability, that long-term economic outlook will help to provide that confidence yet again in the Panamanian economy.
Yes. It was no surprise to me. Given my background, I had anticipated a downgrade, and there was pretty much a consensus among people who follow that. The question was when it was going to happen and how many of the rated agencies were going to do it. And probably the one to act first, it was somehow discounted that it was going to be Fitch. But the big question is when. I had expected it was going to be in November or December at the latest. I do have to admit that that they made a decision in February. It took me by surprise. How long does it take to get it back? Look at history and look at the countries that have gone through the same process. Some countries have turned that around in as little as 2 years, 3 years. Some others have taken them 17, 20 years. I believe we can, obviously I cannot predict a year specifically, but I see ourselves with the measures we're taking that we're more on the side of the short term. And our plan is very clear. There's no improvisation here. We have a path, we have a route, we have a map to go, and and we are in the process of communicating that. So there are not going to be any uncertainties given that. Therefore, as of today, we have the benefit of the doubt of the other two rating agencies. And as we delivered as we walk our talk, they're going to see. They're going to see that we mean what we say.
What Panama also means is Panama's also been a long time top destination for foreign direct investment. And competition for that investment, though, continues to increase across the region. You started talking beforehand about the long-term plan, right? And having more of an Asia mindset as you're looking at your investment your economic outlook. What are some other new incentives? You talked about transparency as well, but incentives or policies are being implemented or planning to implement to attract and retain investors in a number of high-value sectors that are so important to the economy, like finance, logistics, technology?
First of all, I'm a true believer in competition, in the force and strength of competition. Competition works wonders. And I come from a world where I had to compete every single day with the world, not only with Panamanian firms, but I had to compete with New York, firms from New York and Florida and the rest of Latin America. So I do believe on that. Makes you better, makes you more productive. It brings innovation. So it's good to have competition. I would worry if we didn't have it because you get too comfortable. Therefore, I'm pretty much the things I've said before, it's opening the path towards not just keeping the level of competition, but improving it. Just to give you one example, the expansion of the Panama Canal was not an end in itself. It was a medium to make a lot of more things. And we're way far away from achieving that potential. But way off. So the next decades, there's a tremendous opportunity. One of the most important comparative advantages of Panama, it's a geographical location that cannot be copied. As simple as that.
Yeah.
And we are way, way far away from exploiting the full potential of that. I'm an optimistic about the future of Panama. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting with you here talking about that.
And Minister, not only the geographic location, but it's a beautiful country, right? So when you're looking at investors coming in, you also want a good environment to be able to do that. If you could share a little bit about, you mentioned them beforehand, how you're focused throughout your entire career. You're, of course, a public servant for nearly 4 months now, but your entire career been very much focused on providing that transparency, right? If you could speak a little bit about the efforts that Panama's taking to specifically to create a more business enabling environment and to create these conditions, these transparency conditions that are so fundamental for foreign companies to say that they're going to establish their long-term presence in Panama. I'll share with you that we've done a lot of work here at the Atlantic Council on nearshoring. And Kareem Lacina's here in the audience from Millicom. We've worked very closely with Millicom and others on this. And Panama's part of that broader equation. What we see as nearshoring has both kind of push and pull factors, right? And so what are countries themselves doing to pull in investment? And one thing that is so important is that favorable business climate for investors and provide that transparency, that regulatory certainty. So if you could share a little bit more about your plans, especially looking into the year that's coming, to provide even further regulatory certainty to be able to attract that critical investment.
Investment is critical, and it's a prerequisite for economic growth. Economic growth, you need investment or capex or capital expenditure, and you need consumption. And we need both local investments and foreign direct investments. And they are in the top part of our agenda, and we're working on that. But only attracting foreign direct, the best profile, not only the amount, but the quality. And we're about to enter the 4th decade of the 21st century. And this world is moving extremely fast. So we want to focus on the right foreign direct investments that can add value, that can transfer knowledge, So we're going to be focusing on that.
I want to. You've spoken recently about, and you mentioned earlier the budget, right? And Panama recently adjusted budget targets, but as you've talked about, remains committed to achieving its economic goals. And you've also noted that investors are starting to show confidence in Panama's ability to continue to reduce its debt, right? You're seeing that from a number of investors. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the steps that are being taken to align the revised budget? You're in the mix of this right now with fiscal objectives, and what does that mean for the medium-term economic outlook?
I believe we presented the most responsible, disciplined, realistic, achievable budget in the past years that I can remember. And that's obviously, is then again consistent with what we've been saying. So we said we were going to do it, and we did it. We presented a very responsible budget. Actually, it's been, that comes with a lot of explanation and education to understand that fiscal discipline is not to punish anyone. You need it. You really need it to achieve human development. And to achieve human development, you need economic growth. And for that, you need trust. And you need to have a fiscal environment which is viable, which is achievable, that produces stability, lowers the cost of accessing financing and equity. So it's all connected. Yeah. And that translates into, basically it's looking a virtuous cycle to trigger that.
And what are your thoughts as you're kind of in the midst of this budget revision insofar as where do you think you'll come out?
I'm very optimistic. And the scenarios that we have in front of us, I think they're all very good. The different scenarios are very good for the country. Very optimistic.
One thing, Minister, we talked about earlier, and I want to drill down this a little bit more, is the importance of the Panama Canal. And the canal remains one of your country's most important economic assets. We've spoken before about not only the impact of the canal itself, but all the environment around the canal as well, right? And there's, of course, been a number of concerns this year about water levels in the canal. Some estimates show that transit through the canal this year has dropped by almost a third. So with global shipping patterns continuing to evolve, what are some of the strategies that are being looked at to keep the canal working? And relatedly, how is the government planning to address some of the impacts that climate change very well might likely have on the canal's operations, given the importance of the canal for the country's long-term economic trajectory?
Well, Panama has lived and suffered a climate instability. That I can tell you. Never let a crisis go to waste.
Never let a crisis go to waste.
No.
That's right.
Panamanians now are more aware than ever of the value of water. That's our oil. For that, the Panama Canal has very focused plans in addressing that issue. Foremost, Panama's carbon neutral, and I must emphasize that. Many people don't know that. One of the few countries in the world. And the water is not only about the canal, but also for people. In one of the countries that has the most water in the world, actually. So the plans to invest in having that hedging of having enough water to face a challenging situation just like El Niño that we experienced. The canal is back to normal levels. Canal usually, the typical day of the canal is 36 ships going through the canal. And at the worst moment of the route, it was about 20 ships. We're back to 36. So great for the rain. We're back like business as usual. But we learned from the just very recent crisis, and we're going to take very, we're going to take strategic measures to address that, which at the same time it's going to be an opportunity because we're going to be diversifying the sources of water, so we're going to have a more available water for the people of Panama, which also everyone deserves to get water. So it's, then again, never let a crisis go to waste. No.
Well, I remember, I think it was about 2 years ago, Adrian and I took a speedboat down the Panama Canal to go to see Barra, Colorado. And so it was impressive to see the ships traversing through the canal. But the canal is so important, of course, for Panama but also, of course, Minister, it's so important for global shipping, right? And so important that, as you say, that Panama doesn't let a good crisis go to waste because of the impacts of lower water levels, reduced traffic through the canal, and what that means for global supply chains.
Panama is a good global citizen, so much that we are aware that the Panama Canal is not just important for Panama, it's important for the world.
Yeah.
Even though its market share is about 5% of global trade, still 5%, it's quite important. And we're aware of that. We are aware that we have a responsibility with the rest of the world. That's one of the reasons we're addressing the water issue. And even though it represents 6% of the GDP of Panama, 6% still very, important enough to take the steps that we're taking.
So, Minister, we're here, I think, still at the beginning, obviously, of World Bank IMF Week. And I want to, and of course, this conference is in partnership with the World Bank and IFC. What do you hope to achieve? For you, when you go back to Panama at the end of this week, what's been a successful week as part of these annual meetings?
Well, a success would be for somehow that people understand that there's a vision in Panama, long-term vision of a country that has enormous potential, great potential, and that we do have a plan. And we're just about starting to work on it, not just in a 5-year plan, but looking for the next generation as a legacy. So I think there's a new chapter. Panama has done greatly in the past 30 years. And actually, we just had one blimp in that record, which was basically part of the world, which was the pandemic.
Yeah.
And besides that, we know that we can achieve human development, we can accelerate growth, we can reduce and locally eventually disappear inequality, improve social mobility, have a great business climate in an open market economy with the rule of law in a strong democracy, which, as Winston Churchill said, is the least worst system that we know. Right. It's complex. Right. It's complex. So every time you go to Congress, here in the United States, it's challenging, but it works. Yeah. It works. So that's our vision.
When you also look, and I want to ask you this last question, when you, Minister Tebet spoke previously about the importance of when I look about areas of cooperation across the region, and Minister Tebet spoke about the low rates of intra-regional trade as she was concluding her conversation before with Valentina. What is your perspective on how to how to accelerate some of this intra-regional trade, and where do you see as additional areas of cooperation among countries in the region? Again, some of the work we've done on nearshoring is how do we, where are there opportunities to further present different countries in Central America as more integrated markets to be able to attract more investment? Where do you see opportunities for greater cooperation in the region?
First and foremost, we need cooperation from the region to help us face the crisis in the Darien Gap, which is not caused by Panama, but we're suffering it the most with pollution, deforestation, damaging, the environment. It's very, very, and obviously, the most important fact, the human cost, the human cost of it. And in terms of trade, yes, it is quite important, but to strengthen democracy and the rule of law, it's quite important. It's quite important as well. So that cooperation among nations within Latin America, it's a prerequisite for advancement. Just look at Asia versus Latin America. If you looked at it 50, 60 years ago, Latin America was much wealthier and successful. We have fallen behind. Yeah. So there's a lot to do that we can do to catch up. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure we will.
And as Adrienne mentioned her opening comments as well, the low rate of economic growth that we see across the region compared to other areas of the world as well.
Well, you mentioned nearshoring, friendshoring, which is a great opportunity for Latin America. And Panama cannot just take advantage of it as a country, but also could be a bridge for other countries to facilitate that. So that would be a great example of cooperation to produce growth and prosperity for other countries beside Panama taking advantage of the opportunity of nearshoring and friendshoring and the microchips acts, to mention one specifically.
Well, Mr. Chapman, I look forward to hopefully continuing this conversation when Adrian and I and others will be in Panama in about a month's time. Again, not only thank you for being here, but I also just want to reemphasize the excitement that we have about Panama, about this new administration, the outlook, the perspectives that you shared, and the president and other members of the government that are here today. Panama is such a vital link across the entire hemisphere, but as you mentioned as well, Panama plays outsized importance on the global scale as well. Thus the importance of having you here today as part of this important conference.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank
it's
you
a
so
pleasure.
much. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Ananya.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Minister Chapman, for what has been a fascinating conversation and a fascinating perspective coming from Panama, like you said, which is central to global trade, and how new industrial policies will be affecting its own domestic economy. A lot of these topics are going to come up again and again throughout this week during the IMF and World Bank meetings. And sort of as the hosts of IMF World Bank meetings are international financial institutions that gather along with central banks and finance ministers from around the world. We're going to continue this conversation with a few of those financial institutions. Joining us today will be Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, Vice President for Latin America and Caribbean at the World Bank Group. In his capacity as the VP for Latin America, Carlos Felipe oversees the World Bank's relationship with 31 countries and promotes the importance of human capital, economic resiliency to shocks like the one Minister Chapman talked about, and highlights the important role that infrastructure plays in these economies. He will be joined by Alfonso Garcia Mora, Vice President for Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean at the IFC. Alfonso leads the IFC's work on both regions while also advocating for the importance of connecting strong private investment and country-specific strategic solutions. We'll also be joined by Sonia Gibbs, who's the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance, joining us from the Institute of International Finance. Her work focuses on sustainable finance and sovereign debt policy, and she runs the organization's work on topics like ESG risks and capital markets development of special interest to the Geoeconomic Center, especially in emerging economies. And to moderate this stellar group of experts, we'll be joined by Michael Stote, who's the Latin America editor for the Financial Times. He's usually in London, but today he's joining us from our studios here in Washington, D.C. Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and welcome to the panel on the Latin American Regional Economic Outlook. I'm delighted to have with me three wonderful experts to explore in a little bit more detail some of the more complex factors behind the region's failure so far to fully capitalize on its advantages, I think we have to say, if we're honest. No? Perhaps this is a session for some hard truths. We heard about Brazil's outperformance this year, which was an extremely welcome development. We heard about Panama's great plans and how well it's doing on attracting investment. But the reality is, if we look across the region, it's a region that's not performing at its true potential. So I'd like to turn first to my panelists and ask them, based on what we were hearing just now, we heard from Simone Tebet, from Minister Chapman, actually, about the importance of long-term planning as one factor. What should we be optimistic about in the economic outlook for the region, and what are the main concerns? Felipe, would you like to start?
Hello. Hello?
I think it's
on. Okay, yeah. Good. Thank you. Thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for hosting us here today. And thank you for that question, Michael. It's a tough one. As you well mentioned, I think we are feeling generally like the region is not taking opportunity of this nearshoring possibility. The geopolitics have shifted. Lots of companies are looking for places to invest. And there's a few countries that I think have done fairly well. Mexico has, has its huge advantage of the proximity to the U.S., and we've seen a fair amount of investment coming to Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and maybe a little bit to Panama and Guatemala. But it really is way below what one would have expected, given the size of the opportunity. And when I reflect on the areas, I think they're relatively obvious. If you work in the region and you ask investors, why are you not investing? The answers are not terribly surprising. What is a bit surprising is that the countries are not jumping to try to address some of the issues. So number one issue that comes up often is just the environment for doing business, the investment climate, the government's regulations. Earlier there was talk of the taxes and the tax rate. So the corporate tax rate in our region, on average, is quite high. It's much, much higher than in Asia. In Asia, on average, is 19%. In Latin America and the Caribbean, on average, is near 25%. Why would you want to invest in Latin America where in Asia they have a much better tax rate and business environment? Well, it's closer. That's the argument is the proximity to the market. But then when you try to set a factory there, then you have the problem of the labor market. Are there enough skills? And we get a lot of complaints of companies that come and they look for the engineers and for the different skills, and they can't find enough of them. Even at the most basic levels, the PISA assessments that compare how kids learn in school, Latin America and the Caribbean, do very poorly. Reading skills.
And this maybe goes to what Minister Tebet was saying now about Brazil, like other countries in the region, spends a lot but doesn't always spend well, because Brazil actually spends quite a lot on education, doesn't it? And so does Argentina and Mexico. But the results, as you say, in PISA are not great. Exactly. So what's going on there?
I think, when you compare some of the Asian countries and how they used to have horrible scores 20 or 30 years ago, and the kinds of deep reforms they did to education. And then you look around in Latin America to see who has dared shaken up that system, you can't find anyone. And I think part of it is that there is a lack of political strength to really confront some difficult political economy issues that have to do with a system that is very well entrenched, where yes, kids now go to school. It used to be 20, 30 years ago that many kids could not go to school. Now they go to school. The problem is they don't learn much. And that's really not terribly helpful to compete in this day and age. Let me just end by telling you that I think to be more optimistic about the future, there's three areas. Number one for me, by far, is education. The countries really need to tackle this head on. Number two, digital technologies and digital skills. Countries can leapfrog, but for that they need to make sure that everybody has access to digital, and they need to have the kind of skills to use that infrastructure. And then finally, I think the upgrade on what I was saying, the investment climate, the facilitation for businesses to come, and including modernizing the tax system. Our latest report on the region that just was published last week has a big chapter on taxes. Yes, countries want more taxes, but you can't just randomly just charge more and more people. You need to be smart about it. You need to learn from countries that have done this well, what kind of taxes make sense. In our report, we were talking about property taxes. We called it wealth taxes, but ultimately we felt that the biggest potential for more taxation in Latin America is making sure that there's more property taxes.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive summary. Sonia, from where you sit globally looking at sustainable finance, sovereign debt, sustainable finance ought to be a big opportunity for Latin America. Sovereign debt, perhaps less of a problem in the region than it has been in the past. How does Latin America shape up from a global perspective on those scores?
Actually, I think there are quite a lot of reasons for optimism on this score. First of all, thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting the IIF to be here today. I think it's increasingly clear when we talk about debt and debt sustainability, we are also talking about climate and environmental sustainability. The two are inextricably linked. And you kind of put this into two categories, right? The debt problems for wealthy countries, debt problems for emerging and low-income countries. They're very different. There is no end in sight to fiscal deficits and debt. I mean, no matter who wins the US presidential election, we've got that coming at us. And the main point here is not systemic stability risk, but more the trade-offs that come with those debt and debt service levels. The more debt service you have, the more of your revenues you have to spend on debt service, the less you have for other investment priorities, including climate spending. So that's the challenge for Latin America and other emerging markets, that the wealthy countries of the world may not have the resources to devote to fighting climate change and supporting emerging and low-income economies in their fights. So turning to emerging markets in Latin America, I think one of the things I would highlight, and this is from work that I think the World Bank has done here too, 60% of the world's low-income countries are either at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. So we really need to act here. These borrowing costs amount to something like 15% of government revenues in these countries is going to debt service. For wealthy countries, that's trade-offs. For emerging and low-income economies in particular, that's existential, right? You have to spend 15% of your government revenues. So solutions, right? And one of the things that makes me optimistic is that I think the global policymakers around the world, everybody here this week in Washington, D.C., is very focused on addressing these twin problems of debt and climate. So the IMF, World Bank, G20 Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable kind of brings together borrowing countries, creditor countries, and private sector in a very unique gathering to address these issues. And I think if we can work on this, if we can make debt restructuring fairer and more efficient, if we can relieve some of the debt burdens, if we can address liquidity strains before they become solvency strains, if we can make better use of things like state contingent debt instruments, so GDP-linked bonds or climate-resilient hurricane bonds, whatever it is, to help countries both manage their debt and address climate problems. And above all, building resilience. And I wanted to pick up on something that you had said there, Carlos, because that might be the single most important thing we can do to support debt sustainability and stable flows of capital to Latin America and other emerging markets. You've got to have greater policy and debt transparency, thing one. That's a prerequisite for better credit ratings, for market access. Also in areas like blended finance and securitization. You know, President Banga is looking at this private sector investment lab to sort of securitize things. You've got to have the right investment environment to make all of these tools work.
Latin America has been quite innovative, hasn't it, in climate finance and sustainable finance?
Very proactive here.
You think of countries like Chile and Ecuador have been pioneers in some of these instruments.
Yep.
Right?
Yep, and with the support of the multilateral system, you know, the work of the IFC, the work of the World Bank, the IDB, all the multilaterals here, that really is able to catalyze private capital. And I think that's one of the things that makes me optimistic, because when you look at where investors want to be, certainly Latin America is one of those places. The G20 presidency under Brazil has really underscored the potential of this region in terms of protecting natural capital too. You know, the rainforests in the Amazon, it's so much potential.
Thank you, Sonia. Now, Alfonso, if we could turn to you. I mean, you've thinking of, you're very much involved in the relations of the private sector, and in a past role you were a global director for competitiveness and innovation. And thinking of what Carlos Felipe was saying earlier about Latin America's ability to attract private investment, how welcoming the environment is for private investment, how does it look to you at the moment, Latin America shaping up versus Asia, say, at a time when we're thinking of nearshoring investment? And what does the region need to do to make itself more competitive?
If I will have, well, first of all, thank you, Atlantic Council, for inviting me. So if I will have to summarize in one word, it's really productivity. So this is the problem that we have in Latin America. In my view, what I call the corporate missing middle. There are no mid-cap companies in Latin America. When you look at the labor market, you see that 70% of the workers are either self-employed or work for companies that has less than 10 employees. And then you have a aristocracy of very large companies that are very competitive, but you don't have anything in between. And that's a big problem on the economic structure of Latin America. Because if you don't strengthen the middle corporate class, if you wish, then it's actually very difficult to increase productivity and to create the competition that is needed. You ask about Asia. When you compare the productivity growth and levels in Latin America during the last 25 years versus Asia, 0.2% increase in Latin America to more than 2% increase in East Asia. And actually, when you compare the economic structures in one place and the other, you see that actually East Asia made a huge effort to increase medium-sized companies, to strengthen medium-sized companies. What do we need to make that happen? I think, I fully agree with Felipe, there is a need to really improve the investment climate, but I would focus on improve the competition that is needed in every single sector. Pick up a country in Latin America, pick up a sector, and you might have problems with competition. You might have problems when finding enough competitive markets. No? And there is where I think the combination of three factors could actually help. One, as Felipe was mentioning, education. But education thinking on skills. When you ask, even in those markets in Latin America with good education systems, you ask the private sector, what is one of your main problems when actually for growing? And they tell you skills. I don't find the skills that I need in the market. So it's education linked to skills, which I think, what are the skills that the private sector and the economy is looking for today that they don't find in the education system? The second one is logistics. We have a huge problem in Latin America in terms of integration. We have a huge problem because you say nearshoring, fine, FDI, fine, but to serve the local market or to export from this market somewhere else? In order to do the second, you actually need the logistics to do so. No? And you don't find it in Latin America. We have huge problems in terms of transport, in terms of digital, in terms of ports of entry. No? And the last one, the last piece, in my view, will be finance, access to finance. And access to finance not only in terms of households, coming back to my first point, middle-sized companies, equity. There is a need for more equity in Latin America because I agree that you don't have a problem of debt. There is actually quite a lot of debt. There is a problem of strengthening the capital structures of many corporates so that actually they can grow. And that part of the ecosystem that is small, medium-sized companies have huge difficulties finding equity to strengthen their capital.
Because
and this is what limits
the
their
regional
growth.
stock markets are sort of comatose, frankly, aren't they? I mean, they're in a pretty bad state outside of Brazil.
Well, and because at the end of the day, to invest in equity, you need to have a long-term perspective. As the Minister of Panama was saying, the long-term approach that he's taking in his country is absolutely fundamental in every single country. Otherwise, you don't put your money in equity, right? You want to make sure that the equity that you are investing has a time horizon long enough so that you will recover or that you will make good money out of the investment that you are making.
Yeah. Thank you. Felipe, if we come back to you, thinking of investment, public investment, infrastructure, which is a key part of competitiveness, that goes to planning. And Simone Tebet was talking about a long-term planning framework. I think Felipe Chapman was also talking about a long-term planning framework. But there's a problem there, isn't there, which is that in Latin America, you have a very short political cycle. You have typically a 4-year political cycle, and then a tendency for a sort of yo-yoing in between parties where the new party comes in, throws out everything the previous party did, starts again. How can you get long-term planning going in that sort of political environment?
Okay, good question. I wish the Minister of Brazil were here, who would be able to answer that better than I could. But, you know, I think, look, there are countries that have relatively short-term cycles that have done quite well. And I'm thinking, I don't know, Korea. How long is the term in Korea? I think it's 4 years, right? Yeah, I think it's 4 years, maybe 5 years. And yet, this is a country that keeps going and has done unbelievably well, surpassed all of Latin America in terms of GDP per capita. So I think it is possible. And then you have other countries that have had long-term planning, like a Caribbean country that's now in a blackout, in a national blackout. They've had really long-term planning. They haven't done well. So I'm not going to mention the country. You have to figure it out. So I think it is possible. It is possible. I've seen a number of countries get interested in thinking long-term. And the Minister Chapman of Panama he's coming in with this idea, and I think it's great. Brazil also, to try to help think things that you're right that people who are very short-term don't think about, which is where do we want to be in 20 or 30 years? 2050, where do we want to take our country? And then what does, slowly come back and say, okay, what does that mean for decisions we need to make today? I think that's valid. I would say that 2 areas are absolutely essential. That's the opinion I would give to any of these countries. The first one, as I said, digital. I think the future is digital. You really need to catch up with digital access to all the people of the countries. Unfortunately, there's still too many that either they don't have access at all because the internet is just not available. I visited the Amazon a couple of times over the last year. In most areas, if there is a little bit of access, it's unbelievably expensive. And then, according to our data, 250 million Latin Americans, yes, they have access, but they can't pay for it, or they don't know how to use it. So those I think, are critical things that we need to focus on. And related to digital, artificial intelligence, we need to get on top of how artificial intelligence will play in Latin America, and because it has positives and it has potential, lots of negatives, and you could have loss of jobs. So we need to proactively get on top of that. And then the second big area that I think is important is green. Green in the sense that, look, our Latin America is the green potential is unbelievable. It's already a very green in its power sector. Most of the energy, more than half of its energy already comes from green sources, hydro dams, more and more solar, more and more wind, because the potential there is really amazing. We are investing in green hydrogen. IFC is investing in Chile, now in Brazil. There's great new resources, and I think the region has a lot to do there. And green also because I think companies are going to be looking in the future to invest in areas where the power is green, where there's a philosophy of doing green things. The minister from Brazil also talked a lot about the Amazon and the importance of preserving the Amazon and not letting the deforestation thing run amok. So we think that that's very important. We are rewarding countries that do things that will help the world. Yeah, we did a nice thing with Uruguay. Uruguay, because they have mainly cattle, it's about methane emissions, and they set themselves targets. If they meet their targets over the next 10 years, we're going to give them a reduction in their debt service to us. That's something that I hope other MDBs can follow. The piece that I don't think we still have figured out is the adaptation bit, the floods, the hurricanes. So we have instruments to do insurance against hurricanes. They insure very partially against them, but the destruction of the hurricanes is massive. We saw these floods in the southern Brazil just recently, which were the worst in that area in 80 years, and the cost was massive to the economy there. And so the adaptation investment, that requires quite a bit of money, quite a bit of long-term planning, so that these things don't wipe out your cities. So that's a big challenge.
Thank you. And thinking more on the green theme, I mean, Sonia, we heard from Minister Tebet, she's saying, what we have to do is make sure that the Amazon forest is worth more standing than it is cut down, which clearly is true, and clearly it's right to create those economic incentives. But what can the financial system do to try and make that happen? Because it's a great sort of objective to have, but how do we actually get there, practically speaking, to a point where forest is worth more standing than cut down?
It's such a great point, right? Because, I mean, how do you incentivize the people who own these resources to not simply deplete them? So I want to say that one of the things we do at the IIF is to just work with our members around the world. So these are banks, insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, but also the MDBs, right? So the World Bank, IFC, the IDB, these are all IIF members. So we straddle public and private sectors. So the first thing I would answer you by saying that it has to be a collaborative, collective solution, or it's just never going to work. And that the private financial sector can't kind of drive transition or green all on its own. The right policy environment has to be in place. And that's really a policymaker's job to sort of incentivize transition across all the real economy sectors. And here I'd just highlight the importance of national transition plans. I mean, this is a real unlock, right? So if you have a credible national transition plan as a country that unlocks financing not just for the sovereign level, but for the companies that are domiciled in your country. We need an enabling regulatory environment that doesn't constrain flows of transition finance. And let me just illustrate one thing here. In this context of de-risking private capital flows, because you've got to bring down the cost of this kind of financing, right? There's inherent risks. You have credit risk, legal, political risk you mentioned, but also climate risk, right? That's an awful lot of risks layered one on top of the other. So, you know, what the World Bank has done in bringing together its guarantees into a single platform, a one-stop shop, that's terrific. Leveraging the MDB balance sheets to catalyze private capital, the blended finance agenda. However, you know, blended finance is hard to scale, right? We've been talking about this for years. This is not new. You need standardization. You need the right legal and regulatory frameworks, project pipelines. Also, the regulatory barriers, including things like the regulatory treatment of MDB guarantees. Those ought to be worth a lot more than they currently are ascribed to in bringing down the risk of these transactions, or just infrastructure, right? I mean, what is sustainable in transition finance? A lot of it is just purely project finance and infrastructure. So the regulatory risk is effectively a barrier. But I just want to go back to this need to build or co-create, I would say, this better investment environment. And one of the things that really makes me optimistic about this type of discussion is that the private sector is kind of contributing to this better environment, sort of capacity building, by letting borrowing countries and companies know what they need, you know, in order to put their money to work there. Sound debt management, credible national transition plans, domestic resource mobilization. You mentioned taxation. That's an uncomfortable truth that every country has to deal with, that this is going to cost money and has to be paid for somehow. We can be honest about these tough political choices. And, you know, you mentioned the monetizing natural resources without depleting them. I want to say here, put in a plug for voluntary carbon markets. You know, there's quite a lot of work being done on this score, and it's very difficult to build high-integrity voluntary carbon markets. But I sit on the board of the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market, and we've done a lot on standards there that are going to enable flows related to natural capital to come to these countries without, as you say, cutting down the trees. And the last thing I just say is that these partnerships to scale blended finance, things like country platforms and so on, it's super important, and you guys do so much good work here in ensuring country buy-in for this kind of initiatives and plans, right? It can't be just handed to countries on a platter and say, here, this is what we want you to do. Countries have to believe, contribute to it, you know, in order for it to work at all.
Thank you. And thinking there on the partnership theme, I mean, Alfonso, wanted to come to you on private-public partnerships, which are a big part, obviously, the work you do, and a big part of the solution to a lot of the problems we've been talking about. But how do you promote those in an increasingly sort of ideologically divided region, where you've got these governments who, on the one hand, might want to tear down the public sector completely, take a chainsaw to the state, to take one example, or on the other side, see the private sector with enormous suspicion and think that the private sector is the sort of source of all evil and has to be constrained as far as possible. So it's a difficult environment, isn't it, that one, in which to get sort of public-private cooperation going?
That's a good question. You know, I like soccer, and it doesn't matter if you are a supporter of Barcelona or Real Madrid. Both of them is fine, as long as you like soccer. So what I wanted to really say is, I mean, at the end of the day, what we want is to provide the better service for the final client, right? What we are interested in the final outcomes, not who owns the asset. That's, to be honest, I don't really care. What I care is that we provide the best service for the citizens. And that is where I think that PPPs make sense, especially in contexts where the fiscal situation of many of these countries, no matter the ideology or no matter what the political party is quite tight. When you have that fiscal situation and you have limited resources and you have lots of needs to allocate those resources, makes sense to think on different instruments where you can minimize the exposure of the public balance sheet and you can maximize the impact that you have. And that is where structures like PPPs make sense, because if there is a space where the private sector could come in, but there might be some uncertainty in the future and you need some de-risking or some participation for the public sector, let's make it. Let's structure it in a way that you can minimize the balance sheet that you need to put at risk from the public sector side and get the same objective at the end of the road. So at the end of the day, it's a question of seeing how to optimize the resources that you have. No? I always tell the same thing to every single counterpart on the public sector side that I meet. You have limited resources, whatever your revenues are, and you want to allocate it and to optimize the use of these resources. So think about the instruments that you have and think about crowding in private sector with all the competitive regulation that is needed to make sure that you allocate your resources, that you bring the private sector on a competitive basis. Fully agree. You need to make sure that it is done on a competitive, and as I said before, competition policy is a big problem in Latin America. But having done so, I really think that the PPPs can help to achieve part of the infrastructure needs that we need. According to the study that we did last year in IFC with the International Energy Agency, there is a need of $150 billion annually until 2030 to meet with the climate goals of the region. $150 billion annually. I mean, these figures are bold figures. Yeah. It is impossible to actually think how to mobilize that capital, not from the private sector, not from the public sector. You really need PPPs. You really need a way in which you can actually think, well, how can I bring the best from every side to actually maximize and get that impact, no? And I think, to what you were saying and Sonia was mentioning, no? Standardization is key. And one of the problems that we face is that we have different taxonomies, for instance. When you look at green bonds, when you look at sustainable bonds, when you look at all these thematic bonds that are absolutely needed, and in IFC we have been promoting, and the World Bank Group promoting these instruments across countries. No? The problem is that when you are an international investor sitting in New York or in London or wherever, and you would like to invest in this type of bonds in different markets, results that the guidelines or the standards that they follow are different. Doesn't make any sense. So you don't create an asset class. If you don't create the asset class, you don't create the depth of the market that you need and the liquidity that you need for those assets. So I think that standardization is key. Creating taxonomies that are equal, is the same for every single country in the region, is going to be, or is absolutely something fundamental, because will allow you to replicate, to standardize, to securitize, or to do whatever you want, to mobilize more capital in a nutshell. No? And I think that that's the essence of what we are talking about. No? Thinking as well that the potential that the region has, and Felipe was mentioning that, is huge. I mean, think about lithium. No? Everybody talks about lithium. 2/3 of the lithium reserves are in Latin America. 2/3 of the world lithium reserves. Have we mobilized all the potential that it has? For sure not.
And how do we do it quickly? Because we don't know how long this lithium boom lasts.
Exactly, and we will need the public and the private sector. We want to have the right, because this is a tricky sector. Mining sector is not an easy sector, and we know that. You need to actually do the right things on the ENS framework, environmental and safeguards, etc. So you need the public, you need the private. But think about food security. No? I mean, Latin America is the main exporter of food in the world. No? So how can we actually adapt the agribusiness and the food security or the food production to the new climate agenda, to the climate adaptation, irrigation methods, etc. So Latin America has a lot of primary, I would say, strengths that we have to put in value. And the problem is that when we try to make them supporting Barcelona or Real Madrid, no, that's the bad way to go. So we have to do it for the good of the citizens.
We have to like the whole league. Yes, exactly. So we've just got time for a last quick round. So. Felipe, I wanted to ask you sort of on this nearshoring opportunity that we're all excited about, but which we all agree is not being made the most of. What's the one piece of advice you'd give governments in the region in terms of how to maximize that opportunity in the near term, sort of quickly? If there's one thing you could pick out as the key thing they could do to help get that investment, what would it be?
I like the idea of that the Minister of Panama explained very, very convincingly, which is to give investors a sense of a medium-term, long-term vision of stability over that they're competent people in government, they know that the private sector is important, that investment is important, and that you are working your best to do the reforms and the changes needed so that investors can come to your country and be productive. I think if we had governments like that, we'd be doing better.
Thanks. And Sonia, from your perspective, from the sort of finance and sustainability perspective, what would be your one key piece of advice to policymakers in the region, in Latin America?
Do you know, I almost want to boil it down to something like sovereign, something like sovereign investor relations. And what I mean by that is only by better communication, better transparency, better disclosure of impact, for example. If you want to tap the global sustainable investor base, those global investors have to know what their money is doing, exactly what their money is doing. So that's transparency about policies and about the impact it's having, for example, on climate or on social development goals, all of these things. So better communication, better sovereign investor relations, you might say. I think it can lay the groundwork for this kind of de-risking that we've been talking about.
That's interesting. And do you think the anti-ESG backlash is hurting at all in this area, or is that more a sort of media phenomenon, if we're honest?
I almost want to call it something of a sideshow in the sense that we know what, former President Trump was and what it all started. But the U.S. investors, banks, investors, basically they know what the demand is from their clients. At the end of the day, it comes down to that, their own fiduciary duty, their own responsibilities toward their clients. The political climate, it might make them a little quieter maybe on the green agenda or trumpeting their achievements, but the intent is still there and the funds are still flowing.
Thank you. And Alfonso, from your perspective, a piece of advice to policymakers in the region on how to maximize the opportunities for private-public partnership, what would you suggest?
I would suggest to focus on the development goal that they have. I mean, what do they want to achieve? What are the final outcomes that they want to achieve? And then think recursively on what are the instruments that they can actually put at the service to achieve that goal. I think that sometimes we do the sequencing on the other way, which is wrong. We shouldn't think on, I'm going to use this instrument or this institution or this to achieve that. No, think about what you want to achieve. Let's define an objective, hopefully a long-term objective, as Felipe was mentioning, and then think recursively how you can bring the private sector and the public sector to maximize the achievement of that objective.
Well, thank you very much, Felipe, Sonia, and Alfonso, for your insights and your advice. And I hope some of the region's policymakers are tuned in, because I think there was some very valuable insights there. And I think the other thing we'd say is, all of us really, including those of us in the media, really want to see Latin America succeed. I think we're all excited by the opportunities, excited by what could happen, by the moment, if you like, the opportunity that's there for the region. But we really want to see the region seizing it with both hands. And let's hope that some of these things we've spoken about today start to happen over the next months and years ahead. So thank you again very much. And thank you to the Atlantic Council.
Michael, I want to thank you for moderating this great conversation. Felipe, Sonia, Alfonso, thank you so much for your contributions. With that, I also want to thank the rest of our speakers from Brazil, Panama. We've covered a lot of ground recently today. And like you said, I'm really excited about the opportunity Latin America and the Caribbean region represents for us here in the U.S., especially during IMF World Bank Week. On behalf of the Geoeconomic Center, I also want to thank Jason Marzak, Valentina Sater, and Adrian Arsh for being continued partners of our work here for many years now during IMF World Bank Week. Thank you for that. And finally, I'd like to thank our great audience here today in person and those listening in to our events. Please tune in for the rest of our events for the rest of the day as well as for the rest of the week. And I thank you all for being a part of this today. Good afternoon.